The morning of July 10th, 1941. A Belgian farmer whose name history has not preserved walked through his fields near the village of Lichtervelde, western Belgium. The wheat stood tall despite the occupation, despite the hunger, despite everything. He moved between the rows with the practiced gait of a man who had worked this land for decades. Then he saw it, tangled in the stalks, a parachute, cream-coloured silk, 3.5 feet across, collapsed like a deflated lung. Attached to it, swaying slightly in the breeze, hung a small wicker container. The farmer froze. In occupied Belgium, anything dropped from British aircraft meant death if discovered. The Germans had made that abundantly clear. Posters in every town square promised 625 francs for turning in such contraband. The same posters promised execution for those who hid it. But curiosity, or perhaps defiance, moved his hands faster than fear moved his feet. He pulled the container free. Inside, something cooed. He opened the lid carefully, and a pigeon blinked up at him with black, ancient eyes. Tucked into a crevice of the container sat several sheets of rice paper, translucent as insect wings, alongside a questionnaire printed in French. At the top, in clean typeface, it read, "Information requested by the British government." The farmer's heart hammered against his ribs. He concealed the container in a sack of potatoes and made his way, not to the German commandantur, but to the de Bailey family's corner shop, 2 villages over. He knew they were patriots. He knew they hated the Germans. He knew they might know what to do with this cooing piece of contraband that could get them all killed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The de Bailey shop sat at a crossroads in Lichtervelde, modest and unremarkable, the kind of place where farmers bought rope and housewives purchased thread. But inside, 5 siblings had been waiting for something, anything, that might allow them to strike back at the occupier. Arsene, Gabriel, and Michel, 3 brothers along with their 2 sisters, had watched the Wehrmacht march into their town in May of 1940. They had watched Belgian soldiers disarm. They had watched King Leopold surrender. They had watched their country disappear beneath the swastika, and they had seethed in impotent rage. Until now, Michel de Bailey examined the pigeon with the practiced eye of a fancier. He had kept pigeons before the war, racing them on Sunday mornings when the world still made sense. This bird was British, that much was certain. A racing homer, bred for endurance, and the mysterious magnetism that pulled it back across hundreds of miles to its loft. The questionnaire explained the rest. British intelligence wanted information, troop movements, fortifications, morale, anything that might help defeat the Reich. But the de Baileys were shopkeepers, not spies. They needed help. They needed someone who understood intelligence work, someone who could write with the precision and detail that London would trust. They needed Father Joseph Raskin. Joseph Maria Raskin was not a typical Belgian parish priest. Born in Stavoort in 1892, he had joined the Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, taking vows in 1910, but his calling had led him far from the quiet chapels of Belgium. He had served on the Western Front in the First World War, not as a chaplain, but as an observer, sketching German positions with an artist's precision and a soldier's eye for detail. Those drawings had guided Allied artillery. After the war, he had gone to Inner Mongolia as a missionary, where he mastered spoken and written Chinese, developing a calligraphic discipline that could compress entire sentences into millimeters of space. When war came again in 1940, Raskin had been drafted as a military chaplain, serving as personal advisor to King Leopold III himself. He had celebrated Mass with the monarch just days before the surrender. The capitulation had broken something in Raskin, but it had not defeated him. If Belgium's army could not fight, perhaps Belgium's civilians could spy. The de Baileys summoned him on the evening of July 10th. Raskin arrived after dark, moving through Lichtervelde's empty streets with the casual confidence of a priest on parish business. In the back room of the shop, by candlelight, they showed him the pigeon and the questionnaire. Raskin studied the rice paper for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just seen an opportunity for revenge. "We will need more paper," he said quietly. "Much more paper. And we will need information. Real information. The kind that wins wars." Over the next 36 hours, the Leopold Vindictive Network came into being, though they did not yet call it that. Arsène and Gabriel de Bailly drove along the Belgian coast in an old truck, pretending to deliver supplies, but actually counting gun emplacements, noting ammunition dumps, sketching the positions of searchlight batteries. Michel stayed with the pigeon, feeding it carefully, keeping it calm. Raskin coordinated, drawing on his First World War experience to determine what London would need most. Hector Joy, a friend of the family and a man with an obsessive love of military maps, gathered intelligence on a particular chateau near Bruges. Rumours suggested the Germans had turned it into something important. Joy confirmed those rumours. The Château de Tillegem had become the Wehrmacht's central communications hub for all of northern Belgium and northern France, routing encrypted messages from the Netherlands to the Atlantic Wall. British intelligence did not know this. They would. What they created over those hours was not merely a message, it was a masterpiece. Raskin's training in Chinese calligraphy allowed him to write with impossible precision, each letter formed with brushstroke discipline, compressing 5,000 words onto sheets of rice paper barely larger than cigarette wrappers. He sketched maps so detailed that every German bunker along 67 kilometers of Belgian coastline appeared in miniature, annotated with troop strengths, field gun calibers, and supply line vulnerabilities. He documented the results of recent RAF bombing raids with the objectivity of a war correspondent. He reported on civilian morale, on the effectiveness of BBC broadcasts, on the tightness of German security. He provided technical intelligence on radar installations whose existence British scientists had suspected but never confirmed. Every millimetre of space held information. There was no wasted ink, no unnecessary word. It was intelligence distilled to its essence, packaged for a bird. On the morning of July 12, 36, hours after the farmer had found the parachute, Michel de Bailly carried the pigeon to the roof of the shop. Attached to its leg, in a cylinder barely 3 millimeters wide, sat the message that would become known to British intelligence as message number 37. The cylinder weighed almost nothing. The intelligence inside it could shift the course of the war. But before Michel released the bird, something remarkable happened. Something that violated every principle of clandestine tradecraft, every rule of resistance security, every lesson learned in blood by underground movements across occupied Europe. The de Bailly siblings and Father Raskin gathered on that rooftop with a small camera and took photographs. They photographed themselves holding the pigeon. They photographed the message container. They photographed the parachute that had delivered it. They photographed each other grinning like schoolchildren on an adventure, not resistance fighters committing acts punishable by death. The sheer recklessness of it defies understanding, unless you understand that these were not professional spies. They were amateurs, drunk on the possibility of striking back, intoxicated by the first meaningful act of resistance they had been able to perform in 14 months of occupation. They signed their message, Leopold Vindictive. Leopold for their king, who they refused to believe had truly abandoned them. Vindictive for HMS Vindictive, the British warship that had attacked Zeebrugge and Ostend in 1917 during the First World War, when Belgium had last been occupied, last been conquered, and last been liberated. The name carried weight, it carried history, it carried a promise. Then Michel opened his hands, and the pigeon launched itself into the Belgian sky. The bird flew southeast, climbing above the occupied fields, above the Wehrmacht checkpoints, above the world of ration cards and identity papers and casual brutality. It flew with the single-minded purpose that evolution had burned into its brain across millions of years. Home. The concept transcended nations and ideologies and wars. Home meant safety. Home meant food. Home meant the loft where it had hatched, somewhere in the green fields of Kent, England, 250 miles away across the English Channel. German marksmen stationed along the coast fired at pigeons as a matter of routine. Sometimes they hit them. The Luftwaffe had deployed peregrine falcons, nature's most efficient aerial predators, to intercept British birds. The falcons dove at over 300 kilometers per hour, striking with talons designed to decapitate prey mid-flight. 23 British pigeons died this way during the war, torn apart in the sky by birds that didn't care about politics, only about hunting. But this pigeon was fast, and it was lucky, and 36 hours after leaving Lichtervelde, it arrived home. The owner, a pigeon fancier in Kent who had volunteered his birds for the war effort, found it exhausted in its loft on the morning of July 14th. He removed the cylinder from its leg, called the number he'd been given, and within an hour, message number 37 was in the hands of MI-14, subsection D, the Special Continental Pigeon Service. The office occupied a basement room in the War Office in central London. 2 men ran it. Brian Melland, a former theatrical actor who brought a certain dramatic flair to intelligence work, and Alexander Sandy Sanderson, a veteran of the Highland Division in the First World War, who understood that wars were won with information as much as ammunition. They had initiated Operation Columba in April of 1941, dropping the first pigeons over occupied Europe with more hope than expectation. Most birds never returned. Some fell into German hands. Some were eaten by starving villagers. Some were simply lost. By July, they had received 36 messages. Most were brief, apologetic, unhelpful. Sorry, we saw nothing unusual. The Germans are here, but we do not know numbers. We are frightened. Please send food. One message consisted entirely of a crude drawing of a German soldier with an unprintable caption. The intelligence value ranged from minimal to none. Then they opened message number 37. Sanderson, a hard man who had seen the trenches, sat in silence for 5 full minutes, reading through a magnifying glass. Then he called Melland over. Together, they read it again. Then they called their superior. Within hours, photographs of the message were being couriered across London, to the Admiralty, to the War Office, to MI6, to every intelligence agency with any stake in understanding German deployments in Western Europe. The message contained intelligence that professional spy networks had failed to acquire. It detailed a complete order of battle for coastal defences. It identified the Château de Tillegem as a strategic communications node, a target that RAF bombers would visit within the month. It provided damage assessments that contradicted official German propaganda, proving that British bombing raids were more effective than the Reich admitted. It confirmed the existence and location of radar installations that British scientists had theorized, but never observed. And it provided something else, something perhaps more valuable than any specific intelligence. It provided proof that resistance existed. That ordinary Belgians, hungry and afraid and under the boot of the Wehrmacht, were still willing to fight, still willing to risk everything for the possibility of liberation. The message was so valuable, so unexpected, so perfect, that it reached Winston Churchill's desk. The Prime Minister did not need to know the exact coordinates of every German bunker in Belgium. He had generals for that. But he needed to know that the spirit of resistance lived, that Britain's struggle was not lonely, that when liberation came, there would be allies on the ground ready to rise. Message number 37 told him that it was propaganda as much as intelligence, but propaganda of the most powerful kind, truth. In Belgium, the de Baillies and Raskin waited. They had requested confirmation via BBC broadcast, a common practice for clandestine operations. Every night, Radio London broadcast coded messages to resistance networks across Europe. The hen has laid eggs. Uncle Jacques plays the piano. The moon is full over Normandy. Nonsense, phrases that meant everything to those who knew how to listen. On the night of July 15th, they huddled around an illegal radio in the shop's back room. Keeping a radio tuned to British broadcasts was itself a capital offence. The death penalty applied liberally in occupied Belgium. But they listened anyway, hearts pounding, as the cultured BBC voice read through the evening's messages. Then, Leopold Vindictive, 200. The key fits the lock, and the bird is in the lion's cage. The room erupted. They had done it. They had made contact with London. They had struck a blow, however small, against the occupation. In that moment, in that cramped room smelling of tobacco and old wood, they were no longer powerless. They were no longer victims. They were Leopold Vindictive, and British intelligence knew their name. But British intelligence was not alone in hearing that broadcast. The Abwehr, German military counterintelligence, monitored BBC broadcasts as closely as any resistance network. Every coded message was recorded, analysed, cross-referenced with known operations and suspected agents. The name Leopold Vindictive was new. The number 200 suggested an organisation, perhaps a network with 200 members. In truth, it was a network of perhaps 8 people, most of them family members. But the Germans did not know that. What they knew was that someone in Belgium had just sent high-value intelligence to London via pigeon, and that someone needed to be found before they sent more. The hunt began immediately. German direction-finding trucks prowled the Belgian countryside, searching for illegal radios. Informers were activated, bribed, threatened. The Gestapo increased surveillance on suspected resistance sympathisers. Patrols were doubled along the coast, searching for anything unusual, anyone who might be observing German positions a little too carefully. In Lichtervelde, Leopold Vindictive waited for the next pigeon drop. Raskin had included precise coordinates in message number 37, specifying where future pigeons should be dropped. They waited through July, through August, through September. No pigeons came. In London, bureaucratic infighting paralysed the response. MI-14 wanted to support Leopold Vindictive, with more pigeons, with radio sets, with money and weapons. But MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service, viewed pigeons as a gimmick, a distraction from serious espionage. The Special Operations, Executive, responsible for supporting resistance movements, had its own priorities and its own agents. Territorial disputes, petty jealousies, and simple organizational incompetence prevented any coordinated response. Leopold Vindictive, unaware that London's spy agencies were busy fighting each other instead of the Germans, grew desperate. Raskin had more intelligence to share. The Germans were building new fortifications. V-weapon sites were being constructed in northern France. Allied bombers needed targeting information. But without pigeons, without radio contact, he had no way to communicate except through other resistance networks. This was a fatal mistake. Raskin began reaching out to other Belgian resistance cells, looking for couriers, for radio operators, for anyone who could get messages to London. But the Belgian resistance in 1941 and 42 was riddled with German informants. Some were Belgians who collaborated out of fear. Some were Germans posing as resistance members. Some were resistance members who had been caught, tortured, and turned. The Abwehr had spent 18 months infiltrating every network it could find, and it was very good at its work. In early May of 1942, approximately 10 months after message number 37 reached London, Father Joseph Raskin was arrested by the Gestapo. He had been betrayed by a brother-in-law of a Belgian police inspector he had trusted. Within days, Hector, Joy, and Arsène de Bailly were also taken. The Germans were thorough. They wanted everyone. Raskin was transported to Germany, to the Gestapo prison at WWII near Cologne. There, in conditions that survivors later described as medieval, he was interrogated. The Gestapo wanted names. They wanted networks. They wanted to know how many members Leopold Vindictive had, where they were, what they knew. Raskin, who had survived the trenches of the First World War, who had buried friends and watched men die screaming for their mothers, gave them nothing. The trial came on August 31st, 1943, more than a year after his arrest. By then, the Reich's People's Court, under the notorious Judge Roland Freisler, had relocated from Berlin to Papenburg in Lower Saxony to escape Allied bombing. Freisler, who would die 2 years later when a bomb fell directly on his courtroom during an American raid, conducted trials with theatrical brutality. He screamed at defendants. He humiliated them. He interrupted their testimony with bellowing denunciations. Justice was theatre, and the outcome was always predetermined. 3 members of Leopold Vindictive received prison sentences. Raskin, Joy, and Arsène de Bailly received death. On October 18, 1943, in Dortmund, all 3 were executed by guillotine, the Reich's preferred method for disposing of spies and resistance fighters. The blade fell swiftly, efficiently, finally. Joseph Maria Raskin, who had served his God and his country in 2 world wars, who had learned Chinese calligraphy in Mongolia and sketched enemy positions in Flanders, who had written 5,000 words on rice paper and sent them to London on the leg of a pigeon, died at 51 years old in a German prison courtyard. But Operation Columba did not die with him. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Between April of 1941 and September of 1944, British intelligence dropped 16,554 pigeons over occupied Europe in an arc stretching from Copenhagen to Bordeaux. Most were never seen again. Only about 10% returned, roughly 1,600 birds carrying 1,000 messages. The Germans shot them from the sky. Falcons tore them apart mid-flight. Starving civilians ate them. Collaborators turned them in for reward money. Parachutes failed. Birds got lost. The obstacles were enormous, the success rate abysmal. But the intelligence that did get through changed the war in small, crucial ways. Message number 37 was not unique in its value, but it was unique in its perfection, in the sheer artistry and dedication that Leopold Vindictive had poured into it. It became a legend within British intelligence circles, a proof that even in the darkest corners of occupied Europe, courage survived. The irony was profound, almost absurd. The German Wehrmacht in 1941 possessed the most technologically advanced military in history. They had Enigma encryption machines that generated billions of possible code combinations. They had radio networks spanning continents. They had radar that could detect aircraft hundreds of miles away. They had deployed more scientists, more engineers, more resources toward communications security than any military in history. And they were defeated, repeatedly, by birds. Birds that operated on instincts developed millions of years before humans invented language, let alone radio. Birds that couldn't be tortured for information, couldn't be bought or intimidated or deceived. Birds that simply flew home, carrying tiny scrolls of paper, executing a mission they didn't understand for people they didn't know, guided by magnetism and memory and the simple, overwhelming need to return to the place they were born. The technological sophistication of the Wehrmacht meant nothing against this. You cannot intercept a pigeon with radio direction-finding equipment. You cannot decrypt a message carried in clear text. You cannot intimidate nature into collaboration. The most primitive form of long-distance communication in human history proved, in specific circumstances, more reliable than the most advanced. This was the revelation that message number 37 forced upon both sides. For the British, it proved that desperation bred innovation, that sometimes the old ways worked better than new ones, that expensive spy networks and elaborate agent drops could be supplemented by a strategy that cost almost nothing and required no training. For the Germans, it proved that total technological superiority did not guarantee total information control, that occupied populations could not be silenced even when you controlled every radio, every telephone line, every official communication channel. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overstated. Pigeons, creatures that most people in 1941 regarded as urban pests, flying rats, fit only for target practice or pie filling, became instruments of strategic intelligence. Farmers who knew nothing about cryptography or tradecraft became spies simply by picking up a bird and filling out a questionnaire. The barrier to resistance dropped to nearly zero. Anyone could fight back. All you needed was a pigeon and enough courage to send it on its way. The Germans understood this threat. A decree issued in 1941 made possession of British pigeons a capital offence. Notices posted in occupied territories offered substantial rewards for turning in birds and promised death for anyone caught using them. Gestapo investigations treated pigeon intelligence with the same seriousness they devoted to professional spy rings. They were right to do so. The intelligence was often excellent. Message number 37 proved that. But here is the deeper irony, the one that cuts to the heart of how we understand belief and evidence. The Germans built their occupation on the assumption that control of technology meant control of information. If you controlled the radios, the telephones, the printing presses, the mail, the telegraph lines, if you controlled every modern communication system, then you controlled the narrative. You controlled truth itself. This assumption was not unique to Nazi Germany. It was, and remains, the foundational belief of every authoritarian regime. Control the flow of information. Control the population. Suppress dissent by suppressing the means of communication. The Reich invested enormous resources in this project. The Gestapo monitored every suspicious conversation. The Abwehr infiltrated resistance networks. German engineers developed increasingly sophisticated radio detection equipment to locate illegal transmitters. Propagandists flooded the airwaves with approved narratives. And it worked, mostly. The vast majority of occupied Europeans never sent intelligence to London. They couldn't. They had no radios, no contacts with British agents, no training, no equipment. The infrastructure of resistance simply didn't exist for them. They were isolated, atomized, rendered voiceless by the occupation's systematic dismantling of communication networks. Until pigeons made communication possible again. Until a farmer found a parachute in his field and discovered that London wanted to hear from him, wanted to know what he saw, valued his testimony enough to send birds across hundreds of miles of hostile territory just to collect it. Until ordinary civilians realized they possessed intelligence that was valuable, that their observations mattered, that they were not powerless after all. This is the psychological shift at the core of Operation Columba's significance. It was not primarily about the intelligence gathered, though some of that intelligence was excellent. It was about proving to occupied populations that they could still speak, still be heard, still matter. The pigeons were not just carrying messages. They were carrying proof that the occupation was not total, that London remembered them, that liberation might actually come. When the WWII heard their codename broadcast on BBC Radio, when they heard Leopold Vindictive, the bird is in the lion's cage. They were hearing confirmation of their own agency in a world that had systematically stripped them of all agency. They were shopkeepers. They had no weapons. They had no military training. They lived under constant surveillance in a town occupied by soldiers who could execute them on a whim. And yet they had made contact with British intelligence. They had contributed to the war effort. They mattered. This matters because belief in one's own powerlessness is the most effective weapon any occupation possesses. Once you convince people that resistance is futile, that nothing they do can change anything, that they are too weak, too isolated, too insignificant to fight back once you convince them of this, you no longer need to guard them so closely. They will guard themselves. They will police their own thoughts. They will enforce their own silence. Operation Columba shattered that belief for roughly 1,000 people across occupied Europe. 1,000 individuals or small groups who found pigeons, sent messages, and received confirmation that London cared what they had to say. 1,000 moments when powerlessness confronted evidence of power, when isolation confronted connection, when the occupation's narrative of total control collided with the reality that a farmer with a bird could bypass every Gestapo checkpoint between Belgium and England. The belief that collapsed was not primarily German. The Germans already knew that total information control was impossible. They knew resistance existed. They were hunting it constantly. The belief that collapsed was held by the occupied populations themselves. The belief that nothing could be done, that the Wehrmacht was invincible, that London had forgotten them, that they would remain under occupation forever, voiceless and invisible, erased from the historical record of the war. Message number 37. written in microscopic calligraphy on rice paper and carried by a pigeon named Nothing in Particular, told them otherwise. It told them they were remembered. It told them their intelligence was valuable. It told them to keep watching, keep resisting, keep hoping, because someone was listening. And that message, more than any specific tactical intelligence about German bunker positions or radar installations, was worth its weight in strategic gold. Because wars are won not just with firepower and logistics, but with morale, with belief, with the conviction that victory is possible, that the current nightmare will end, that suffering has meaning and purpose. This is what made Raskin's execution so tragic. He died knowing that he had succeeded. He had made contact with London. He had provided valuable intelligence. He had proven that resistance was possible. But he also died knowing that his success had made him a target, that the very act of speaking truth to power had marked him for death. The Reich could not tolerate voices it did not control. It could not tolerate evidence that its occupation was not absolute, so it killed him, along with Joy and Arsène de Bailly, and tried to erase Leopold Vindictive from history. The attempt failed. Gordon Carrera's book, based on declassified documents from British archives, tells their story. The photographs that the de Baileys so recklessly took on that rooftop in July 1941 survived, hidden in a Belgian museum. The text of message number 37 exists in the National Archives in London, filed under Source Message No. Their names are recorded, their courage is documented. History remembers them, even if the Wehrmacht tried to silence them. This is the final irony. The Reich, which controlled every official record in occupied Belgium, which could erase people from ration lists and identity registers with a stroke of a pen, could not erase them from British archives, could not prevent their story from being told, could not silence the historical record they created by sending a pigeon to England. The occupation controlled space. It controlled physical territory, checkpoints, buildings, roads. But it could not control time. It could not prevent the future from judging it. It could not stop historians from digging through archives decades later and reconstructing what actually happened. It could not prevent the truth, carried on the leg of a pigeon in the summer of 1941, from outlasting the regime that tried to suppress it. When American troops liberated Dortmund in April of 1945, they found German records documenting Raskin's execution. When British intelligence officers sifted through captured Abwehr files, they learned how Leopold Vindictive had been betrayed, hunted, destroyed. When Gordon Carrera interviewed the surviving de Bailly siblings' descendants 70 years later, he heard the full story. The farmer finding the parachute, the decision to contact Raskin, the 36 hours of frantic intelligence gathering, the moment on the rooftop when Michel released the bird, the joy when they heard their codename on BBC radio, the terror when the Gestapo came. All of it survived. All of it entered the historical record, not as German propaganda claimed it happened, but as it actually happened. The occupation could kill witnesses, but it could not kill memory. It could destroy networks, but it could not destroy the evidence that those networks existed. It could terrorize populations into silence, but it could not prevent their stories from eventually being told. This is perhaps the ultimate vindication of Leopold Vindictive's choice to resist. They knew the risks. They knew the probable outcome. Raskin, who had seen the First World War, understood that resistance fighters rarely survived to see liberation. The odds were terrible. The dangers were immense. But they chose to fight anyway, to send that pigeon anyway, to make their voices heard anyway, because silence was a worse fate than death. And they were right. Their silence would have meant something else entirely. It would have meant that the occupation succeeded completely, that the Reich's control of information was absolute, that ordinary people had no agency, no voice, no ability to resist. By refusing that silence, by taking the absurd risk of sending intelligence via a bird that might never reach England, they preserved not just information, but dignity. They proved that the Wehrmacht could occupy territory, but could not occupy souls. Could not force compliance of the mind, even when it commanded obedience of the body. The months following Leopold Vindictive's destruction were dark ones for Operation Columba. Mai 14 received fragmentary reports that Raskin had been arrested. They did not know the details. They did not know about the betrayal, the torture, the show trial under Freisler's screaming denunciations. They simply knew that messages from Leopold Vindictive stopped coming, that the most valuable intelligence source the Pigeon Service had ever developed had gone silent. In London, the bureaucratic infighting continued. Mai 6 still dismissed pigeons as unreliable. The Special Operations Executive still prioritized radio networks and professional agents over amateur civilians with birds. Resources that might have supported resistance networks went instead to operations that looked more sophisticated, more modern, more befitting a 20th century intelligence service. The fact that those sophisticated operations often failed while pigeons occasionally succeeded did not change institutional prejudices. But the pigeons kept flying. RAF crews continued dropping them over occupied Europe through the summer of 1942, through 43, through the brutal winter of 44, when the V-weapons began falling on London. The messages that returned varied wildly in quality. Some were useless. Descriptions of weather, complaints about rationing, pleas for food that Britain could not provide. Some were darkly comic. One Frenchman reported that his wife had cooked and eaten the pigeon before he could stop her, apologizing profusely for destroying his Majesty's property. But some messages were invaluable. Farmers near Peenemünde in Germany reported seeing strange rockets being tested, descriptions that helped British intelligence identify the V2 development program months before the first missiles fell on London. A Belgian railway worker documented Wehrmacht troop movements with such precision that Allied intelligence could predict German defensive positions in Normandy. A Dutch radio enthusiast provided technical details about German radar installations that British scientists had been unable to confirm through any other source. The intelligence trickled in, message by message, bird by bird, building a mosaic of occupied Europe that no spy network could have assembled alone, because the pigeons went everywhere. They fell into fields that no British agent could reach, into villages too small to have resistance organizations, into the hands of people who would never have considered themselves spies, but who became spies the moment they picked up a questionnaire and decided to fill it out. This democratization of espionage terrified the Germans and baffled the British. Intelligence work was supposed to be the province of professionals, trained agents, encrypted radio networks, dead drops and brush passes, and all the elaborate tradecraft that separated amateurs from experts. Operation Columba threw all of that out and replaced it with something almost childishly simple. Drop birds. Hope someone finds them. Hope they send them back. Hope the information is useful. The fact that it worked at all was remarkable. The fact that it sometimes worked brilliantly was revolutionary, because it proved that valuable intelligence did not require professional intelligence officers. It required motivated civilians who happened to be in the right place, looking at the right things, willing to take the risk of reporting what they saw. The Germans could not stop this. They could increase patrols. They could offer larger rewards. They could execute more people. But they could not prevent pigeons from falling into fields, and they could not force every single farmer in occupied Europe to turn them in. The vastness of the occupation area worked against them. There were too many fields, too many villages, too many civilians who hated the Reich and would risk death for a chance to hurt it. By early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, Operation Columba had evolved. The pigeons were no longer being used primarily to gather intelligence. The intelligence networks were established now, the radio networks functioning, professional agents in place. Instead, the pigeons became tools of deception and psychological warfare. False information was deliberately seeded through pigeon messages, designed to be intercepted by the Germans and believed. Pigeons were dropped in areas where the Allies wanted the Germans to think the invasion might occur, carrying questionnaires that asked about beach defences and coastal fortifications in locations far from the actual invasion sites. The Germans, knowing that some pigeon intelligence had proven valuable, could not afford to ignore these messages. They reinforced defences in the wrong places, diverted troops to guard against landings that would never come. The irony had come full circle. The primitive communication method that had allowed occupied civilians to bypass German information control was now being used to feed false information into that same control system. The Abwehr's very success at infiltrating some pigeon networks meant that the intelligence they received through those networks could be manipulated. Trust, once established, became a weapon. The Germans had to assume some pigeon intelligence was real, which meant they had to respond to all of it, which meant they could be deceived by any of it. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the pigeons proved their worth one final time. A bird named Gustav, carried by a Reuters correspondent with the first wave of assault troops, was released from the Normandy beaches at 8:30 in the morning. It reached its loft in Hampshire at 4:50 in the afternoon, covering the distance in just over 5 hours despite injuries sustained during the landing. Attached to its leg was a message confirming that British forces had successfully established beachheads, that casualties were heavy but manageable, that the invasion had not been thrown back into the sea. That message reached London before official military communications could be established, before radio networks were secure, before any other confirmation arrived. For several crucial hours, the British government's only reliable information about whether the largest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded came from a pigeon named Gustav. The bird received the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, for gallantry under fire. Normandy that day bearing messages, bearing blood. Some had been carried by soldiers who were killed in the fighting. When their bodies fell, the pigeons escaped their transport containers and flew home anyway, carrying no messages, but providing silent testimony to the carnage on the beaches. British fanciers who received these birds, blood-stained and traumatized, knew without being told that men had died. The birds themselves became messengers of grief. Operation Columba officially ended on February 14, 1945. By then, Allied forces were advancing across Germany itself. Occupied Europe was being liberated. The need for civilian intelligence gathered via pigeons had passed. Of the 16,554 birds dropped between April 1941 and February 1945, approximately 1,600 returned, roughly 1 in 10. The other 90% died in various ways: shot down, eaten, lost, captured. The survival rate was abysmal, but the intelligence gathered from those 1,600 returning birds filled archives. Thousands of pages of reports, maps, observations, complaints, pleas, jokes, and strategic insights. Most of it was filed away and forgotten after the war. The pigeon service, never glamorous, became even less so in the atomic age. Intelligence services embraced technology, spy satellites, intercepted communications, computer analysis. Birds seemed quaint, almost embarrassing, a desperate measure from a desperate time. For decades, the story of Operation Columba was barely known outside classified archives. The pigeons received no monuments. The civilians who risked death to send messages received no recognition beyond their families' private knowledge. Leopold Vindictive was a footnote, if mentioned at all, in histories that focused on major battles and famous generals and the grand strategic moves that shaped the war's outcome. Joseph Raskin was remembered in Putel, Belgium, but primarily as a missionary and priest who had died in the war, not as the intelligence asset whose single message had reached Churchill. The de Bailly family rebuilt their shop after liberation and rarely spoke of their wartime activities. The photographs they had taken on that rooftop in July 1941 sat in a drawer, then in an attic, then in a local museum that barely understood their significance. The farmer who found the parachute in his field was never identified. He disappeared into the anonymity of history, one of millions of unnamed people who made small choices that accumulated into large consequences. We do not know if he survived the war. We do not know if he ever learned what became of the bird he delivered to the de Baileys. He was an ordinary man who did an extraordinary thing, and then vanished from the record, which is perhaps the most accurate representation of how resistance actually worked. because resistance was not primarily the province of heroes. It was the province of ordinary people, making small choices in moments of fear. The choice to hide a parachute instead of turning it in. The choice to trust the Debailis instead of the Gestapo. The choice to risk death for the possibility that a bird might reach England, might deliver a message, might somehow make a difference. Those choices accumulated. One farmer's decision led to the Debailis' involvement, which led to Raskin's message, which led to Churchill seeing proof that resistance existed, which reinforced British commitment to eventual liberation, which encouraged other resistance networks, which provided intelligence that saved Allied lives during the invasion, which shortened the war by days or weeks or months impossible to quantify, but real nonetheless. This is how wars are actually won, not through grand heroic gestures, though those matter, not through technological superiority alone, though that helps, but through the accumulated weight of millions of small decisions made by people whose names history never records: the farmer who hid a parachute, the shopkeeper who contacted a priest, the priest who spent 36 hours writing 5,000 words in microscopic calligraphy, the pigeon fancier in Kent who noticed a returned bird and called the right number. Each decision was small. Each person was ordinary. Each choice seemed insignificant in isolation. But together, they formed a network of resistance that the Wehrmacht, for all its power, could not crush. Because you cannot crush decentralized action. You cannot arrest everyone. You cannot guard every field. You cannot control every pigeon. The technological sophistication that the Reich had invested in the Enigma machines, the radar networks, the radio direction-finding equipment, the massive signals intelligence apparatus was designed to counter sophisticated threats. It was designed to intercept radio transmissions, decrypt coded messages, locate clandestine transmitters, identify professional spy networks. It was very good at doing these things. It was not designed to counter birds. And this is the final lesson of Operation Columba, the one that echoes across decades into our own time. Technology creates vulnerabilities, even as it provides capabilities. The more sophisticated your systems become, the more dependent you are on those systems functioning as designed. The more you centralize control, the more catastrophic the consequences when control fails. The more you invest in complex solutions, the more vulnerable you become to simple problems. A pigeon is a simple problem. It requires no electricity, no encryption, no infrastructure. It cannot be hacked or jammed or decrypted. It does not leave an electronic signature. It cannot be tortured for information it does not possess. It simply flies home, guided by biology older than human civilization, carrying whatever you attach to its leg. Against this, the Wehrmacht's technological say, superiority meant nothing. You cannot out-technology biology. You cannot encrypt against instinct. The most advanced military in the world in 1941 was defeated, repeatedly, by the same method humans had used to send messages in the Roman Empire, in ancient Egypt, in civilizations so old we have lost their names. This should have been humbling. It should have forced a reconsideration of what security means, what control means, what advantage means in an era of technological warfare. Instead, it was mostly forgotten. After the war, both the West and the Soviet Union embraced technological solutions to intelligence problems with even greater fervor. Spy satellites replaced pigeons, encrypted communications replaced rice paper, computer analysis replaced human judgment. And yet, the fundamental dynamic that Operation Columba revealed remains true. Centralized systems, no matter how sophisticated, cannot control distributed resistance. Technology, no matter how advanced, cannot eliminate human agency. Power, no matter how overwhelming, cannot silence voices that refuse to be silenced. This is what Leopold Vindictive proved in the summer of 1941. Not that pigeons were better than radios, they weren't. Not that amateur resistance could replace professional intelligence, it couldn't. But that the belief in total control, the assumption that technological superiority guaranteed information dominance, the conviction that occupied populations could be rendered voiceless through systematic surveillance and brutal repression, That belief was false. It was false because humans are not passive. We do not accept powerlessness easily. Given any opportunity, however small, however dangerous, however seemingly futile, we will resist. We will find ways to speak when we are commanded to be silent. We will send messages when we are told communication is impossible. We will hope when we are surrounded by despair. A farmer finds a parachute in his field and makes a choice. That choice echoes across time. We remember it now, 84 years later, not because it changed the strategic calculus of the war, though it helped, but because it represented something that matters more than strategy. It represented the refusal to surrender agency, the insistence on remaining human even in inhuman circumstances. The decision to resist, not because resistance was likely to succeed, but because the alternative was to accept the occupation's claim that resistance was futile. Joseph Raskin died on a guillotine in Dortmund on October 18, 1943. He was 51 years old. He had served his country in 2 world wars. He had learned Chinese calligraphy in Mongolia, sketched German positions in Flanders, celebrated Mass with a king, and written the most perfect intelligence message the British Pigeon Service ever received. He died knowing that his message had reached Churchill. He died knowing that he had succeeded. The Reich that killed him outlasted his death by less than 19 months. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The occupation of Belgium ended. The nightmare that had begun in May of 1940 concluded in liberation. The people who had sent pigeons to England, who had resisted in small ways and large, who had refused to believe that the occupation would last forever, they were vindicated. Not all of them survived to see it. Raskin did not. Joy did not. Arsène de Bailly did not. Thousands of others who had hidden pigeons, filled out questionnaires, sent messages, committed small acts of defiance. Many of them died before liberation came. They died in Gestapo prisons, before firing squads, on gallows, in concentration camps. They died believing that they had struck back against the occupation, that their deaths meant something, that their voices had been heard. They were right to believe this. Their voices had been heard. Their messages had been received. Their resistance had mattered, not always in ways that could be quantified, not always in ways that changed battles or saved lives, but in ways that preserved the possibility of resistance itself, that proved to others that defiance was possible, that demonstrated through action what words could never quite capture, that human dignity survives oppression, that courage exists in ordinary people, that even the weakest can resist the strongest when the cause is just. This is why we tell their story. Not because Operation Columba was decisive in the military sense, it wasn't. Not because pigeons were superior to other intelligence methods, they weren't. But because the story contains a truth that we need to remember in every era, in every place where power seeks to silence dissent. Resistance is always possible. Voices cannot be permanently silenced. Even the most comprehensive surveillance system, even the most brutal repression, even the most sophisticated technology cannot eliminate human agency completely. There will always be a farmer who finds a parachute and makes a choice. There will always be a priest who writes 5,000 words in microscopic calligraphy. There will always be a pigeon that flies home. There will always be a message that gets through. The occupation believed it controlled everything. It controlled the roads, the radios, the newspapers, the police, the military, the government. It controlled who could speak and who had to listen. It controlled the official narrative of events. It controlled, or thought it controlled, reality itself, but it could not control a bird flying southeast from Lichtervelde toward Kent, could not control a farmer's conscience, could not control Raskin's determination to resist, could not control the fundamental human impulse to speak truth even when truth is dangerous, especially when truth is dangerous, because silence is a form of death. The lesson of Leopold Vindictive is not that resistance guarantees survival. It doesn't. Raskin, Joy, and Arsène de Bailly were executed. Many others who sent pigeons to England were arrested, tortured, killed. Resistance is dangerous. It costs lives. It demands sacrifice. These are facts that cannot be romanticized away. But the lesson is also not that resistance is futile, because futile would mean that nothing changed, that their actions had no consequences, that they died for nothing. And that is demonstrably false. Their message reached Churchill. Their intelligence aided Allied planning. Their courage inspired others. Their story survived the Reich that tried to erase it. They mattered. They changed things. They won, ultimately, though most of them did not live to see victory. This is the paradox at the heart of resistance. It is simultaneously futile and essential. Futile because individuals are weak, because occupations are strong, because the odds of survival are terrible, and the chances of making a measurable difference are small. Essential because the alternative, accepting powerlessness, surrendering agency, believing the occupation's propaganda about its own permanence, is a form of living death that kills the soul before it kills the body. Leopold Vindictive chose life. They chose to matter. They chose to resist. They paid for that choice with their lives, but they died as free people making free choices, not as subjects meekly accepting their subjugation. And that distinction, invisible on any battlefield, unmeasurable in any strategic calculation, makes all the difference between defeat and victory. When the farmer in Lichtervelde found that parachute in his wheat field on the morning of July 10, 1941, he did not know he was beginning a chain of events that would reach Churchill's desk, that would inspire resistance across Belgium, that would be remembered 8 decades later. He knew only that he had a choice: turn in the parachute and receive a reward, or hide it and risk death. He chose risk. He chose resistance. He chose to matter. That choice, repeated by thousands of ordinary people across occupied Europe, repeated in different forms in different occupations across history, repeated today wherever power seeks to silence truth, that choice is the most powerful weapon the powerless possess. Not because it guarantees success, but because it guarantees that the struggle continues, that hope survives, that the occupation's claim to permanence is revealed as the lie it always was. The bird that carried message number 37 to England in July of 1941 was not remarkable. It was an ordinary racing homer, bred for speed and endurance, trained through repetition, motivated by instinct. It did not understand the war. It did not know it was carrying intelligence. It did not care about liberation or resistance or the future of Europe. It simply flew home because that is what pigeons do. But the message it carried was remarkable. 5,000 words of perfect intelligence compressed into millimeters, written by a priest who refused to surrender, delivered by a bird that could not be intimidated, received by intelligence officers who barely believed what they were reading, shown to a prime minister who saw in it proof that Britain's fight was not lonely. That message, in its microscopic perfection, in its very existence, against all probability and sense, was evidence of something that no amount of German propaganda could counter: that resistance lived, that occupied Europe had not surrendered, that ordinary people remained willing to risk everything for freedom, that even the Wehrmacht, with all its power and technology and ruthless efficiency, could not silence voices that insisted on speaking. The technology has changed since 1941. We no longer drop pigeons from aircraft to gather intelligence. We have satellites and encrypted communications and digital surveillance that would have seemed like science fiction to Raskin and the Debelys. The methods of control have evolved. The mechanisms of resistance have evolved with them. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Power seeks silence. Resistance breaks silence. Technology enables both. And in the end, humans make choices about which side of that equation they occupy. Those choices determine history more than any weapon, any machine, any system of control. Leopold Vindictive made their choice on a rooftop in Lichtervelde, releasing a pigeon into the Belgian sky, watching it climb and turn and disappear toward England. In that moment, they transformed from victims of occupation into agents of resistance, from powerless civilians into intelligence operatives, from people who accepted what they were told into people who spoke truth. The occupation killed them for that transformation. But it could not undo it, could not erase the fact that they had succeeded, that their message had been delivered, that their voices had been heard, could not prevent their story from surviving into an era when the Reich they fought exists only in history books and memorial sites, a warning against tyranny preserved so that future generations understand what happens when technological power serves ideological madness. We tell this story not to glorify war or resistance or sacrifice. We tell it because it is true, because it happened, because a farmer found a parachute and made a choice, because a priest wrote 5,000 words on rice paper, because a bird flew home, because ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances refused to accept powerlessness, and because that refusal, however small it may seem against the scale of industrial warfare and continental occupation, mattered then and matters now, and will continue to matter as long as humans struggle between power and freedom, between silence and speech, between accepting what we are told and insisting on truth. The morning of July 14th, 1941, a pigeon fancier in Kent opens his loft and finds a bird, exhausted, barely alive, a tiny cylinder attached to its leg. He removes the cylinder. He calls the number. Within hours, message number 37 is being read in London by intelligence officers who cannot quite believe what they are seeing. 5,000 words, perfect calligraphy, detailed maps, strategic intelligence of the highest value, and a signature, Leopold Vindictive, a name the Germans would hunt for months, a network they would eventually destroy, but not before the message got through, not before the voice was heard, not before the silence was broken. That is the story. That is what happened. That is why we remember. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.